Good morning and welcome to everybody who is joining us online for this Royal African Society event, and especially welcome to Jakkie Cilliers, who is our guest speaker for today. But welcome to all our listeners who are both live and listening in afterwards. This is the second in the Royal African Society's online webinar series. Last week we spoke to Mohammed Ibn Chambers, the UN representative to West Africa, and that one is available online for anyone who missed it. And in 2 weeks' time, we will host a panel of key figures to talk about the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic on Africa. And we'll be putting details of that on the Royal African Society website imminently. All these events are free to view. But we encourage listeners to go to our website, and you're very welcome if you're not already a member to join up or just to offer a donation so that we can continue in these hard times to organize these events, which I think are very important for connecting with our audience both in Africa and here in the UK and beyond. So please do check out the website before we finish. And while you're there, you might also be interested to look at the African Arguments website, which has the latest information on coronavirus. It has a coronavirus tracker, which you will see is currently up to 33,000 cases reported in Africa, but maybe more. But you'll be able to get the latest information there on the African Arguments. But today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Jakkie Cilliers, who've known each other for some time. Jakkie, I think, is Africa's most distinguished futurist. He's the founder and chair of South Africa's Institute for Strategic Studies and head of its program on African futures and innovation. Now, Jakkie, you have just published a book which looks like this, for everybody who may not have seen it already. Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. And this, is clearly, having just read it over the last few weeks, the product of a lifetime's work, writing, projecting, thinking about Africa. And it's extraordinarily full of ideas as well as of facts. And for any of you who want to get a copy, it's available on Amazon. You can order it wherever you are. A strongly recommended read. Before we start, before I hand over to you, Jakkie, I'd just like to say this is will be an interactive event. And for those of you who wish to ask questions later in the session, you can do it either by sending us a written question through the Q&A function, or by putting your hand up, which should be available at the bottom of the screen, in which case we'll be able to spot it here and ask you to make your put your question orally. But we'll come to that later. First of all, I'd like to give Jakkie an opportunity to explain to us what the book is about and what your feelings about the way to ignite this growth revolution. How can Africa accelerate its growth? What's been holding it back as well? Jakkie, over to you, please.
Nick, thanks very much, and thanks for hosting this, and congratulations on particularly your African Arguments sessions and ideas, which are remarkable, which are really, really invaluable. So Africa First is a book that really encapsulates a number of years of work at the Institute. It tries to answer three questions. It looks where Africa has come from and where it is headed, and then asks the question, what can be done to improve that growth trajectory? So I use, the book is hopefully fairly easy and digestible to engage, but it is serious work. So I use a forecasting platform to look at where Africa has come from and where it is headed, hosted and developed by the Pardee Center at the University of Denver, where I spent several months as a fellow. So the forecasts are not blue skies where we think Africa could be, it is what is possible. I first forecast across various dimensions the likely trajectory, what I refer to as the current path of Africa out till 2040. And then I take different scenarios and I see what would be the contribution, for example, of an agricultural revolution, What would happen if Africa can advance its demographic dividend? What would be the impact of improvements in health, water, and sanitation? What would improved education do? Industrialization, leapfrogging, greater peace and stability, the integration of Africa through the African Continental Free Trade Area. So there are 11 scenarios, each is a chapter. I also look at the impact of the climate change on Africa, as Africa's contribution to climate change, and what's going to happen to jobs. So 16 chapters that look at where Africa has come from, where Africa is, its current path, and then a chapter on each of these 11 scenarios that says what would be the contribution of, for example, agriculture and so on and so forth, to set out where Africa, what is possible by 2040 and what could be done to improve that trajectory. So as much as one can capture 300 pages in a few words, that's about what I try and do in the book. I try, in essence, to look at why the gap is growing between average income levels in Africa and the rest of the world. And that gap has been growing since independence. What do we need to do to start narrowing that gap between income levels in Africa and income levels in the rest of the world?
So, Jakkie, what would you say are the sort of fundamental bedrock changes that what needs to be different from the current trajectory, and which of the various factors, as you say, you list a whole set of factors, which of those are the indispensable ones as a foundation for making this growth transformation?
So Africa's 55 very different countries, Nick, you know that better than most. So to get a handle on this complicated continent, I generally use the World Bank's low, middle, upper middle income country groupings. These are countries that are more or less at similar levels of development, and allows you, although the forecasting is done at country level, to get a handle on where Africa is. So the first response to your question is it depends. If you are an oil exporter, if you're a low income country, and then the concluding chapter takes all these scenarios together and then says what is the impact of what I refer to as an Africa first growth trajectory. But of course, certain components have more impact than others, depending if you're a low income country, lower middle or upper middle income country. Obviously, at low levels of development, agriculture is always more important. But as you go up the growth trajectory, leapfrogging and the integration of Africa through the African Continental Free Trade Area, or trade integration, do better than any others. So those two. The third would be manufacturing. Africa must industrialize. If Africa does not enter what we refer to as the manufacturing escalator and continues on a low growth services escalator, it will never be able to change the productive structures of African economies so that it can advance more rapidly. A prerequisite to all of this is that Africa needs to advance its demographic dividend. Africa is about 30 years away from entering its demographic dividend. Only in about 2050 does the contribution of labor to growth become significant, as it has been elsewhere. And this, probably for me was one of the most interesting takeaways when I started looking at what is the contribution of these different components to growth.
Yeah, no, that's a key issue, because the demographic dividend depends on there being more people working than dependent. And at the moment, the youth bulge is largely in the school age. So these are dependent. And also there's the challenge of all those young people getting a sufficient education to then be productive workers when they graduate into the working bracket. So there are two challenges there, both changing the shape of the democratic curve and educating all those who are coming into the workforce.
There is also a little bit of an automatic correlation that I think often people miss. So what is the demographic dividend? It is the relationship of youth below 15 and elderly above 64 related to the working age population, 15 to 64. If there are too many children, children are a good thing, of course, always, but if there are too many kids, you can't build schools fast enough. roll out water and sanitation rapidly enough. Simply by reducing the number of children that goes through your system, governments have more money to spend on educating those and providing healthcare for those that are in the system. So where it's not actually only that you have to provide education and health to those that are in the system. It is an actual fact that there's an automatic correlation that if you increase the size of the working age population relative to dependents, it increases the rate at which your economy grows automatically. Yes, further escalation, further momentum is obviously provided by, and must happen if you're providing education and health and so on. But in actual fact, that ratio on its own, even if you don't provide additional education and health, already provides a boost to growth.
Now you raised there some very topical issues. The challenge with looking at the future is that we tend to assume a steady state.
Yeah.
And you say yourself, I think on page 303, presciently, it is certain the future will unfold quite differently to what is set out in this book, which is a wise caveat, because of course, since you finished writing it, the coronavirus pandemic has struck the whole world and places growing challenges for African countries, as for everybody else. In some ways, bigger challenges because they don't have the material resources that many Western countries already do to throw at this challenge. How do you think coronavirus is going to impact on your projections? Where is it going to make things more difficult? And perhaps where does it open up some opportunities for Africa?
So let's look at the impact. The IMF, when they released their most recent, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, growth forecast in Africa, basically are forecasting a kind of a V-shaped global impact. In other words, a very sharp contraction in 2020, and then a bounce back on the assumption that there's going to be a vaccine in 2021. So whereas in the IMF previously forecast that Africa was going to grow at about 2.6%, it now forecasts that Africa is going to contract. Its growth is going to go to -3%. That's a difference of 5.6% in average, in percentage points in growth rate. Now this is, the whole world is going to contract. Now, if that happens, Africa's GDP in 2022 is going to be about $190 billion smaller than it would have been before the COVID crisis. Africa's GDP in 2020 is going to be, GDP per capita is going to be about $200 per person less. That's in 2022. And about 11 million more Africans are going to live in extreme poverty in 2022 than would otherwise have been the case. So it is possible to be quite clear about the impact, the economic impact, and the impact on livelihoods that the COVID crisis is going to have in Africa. But it is at the same time important to recognize that the virus is coming to Africa later than anywhere else. And there is a huge degree of uncertainty about its future trajectory in Africa, which why it's not yet really possible to responsibly forecast, particularly on mobility levels. There are many challenges here. Africa's got a much younger population. Median age in Africa is just above 19. I think the median age in the UK is probably about 44, 45. That difference in median age is going to have a huge impact. Apart from that, we have a much more informal economy, a much more rural population. And then there are the seasonal and the climatic challenge differences between where COVID, the impact that it could have in Africa compared to in the rest of the world. So I gave you some figures on what I think the impact will be over the short term, but that's only the economic impact. We actually don't know what it's going to do to mobility and what it's going to do to the issue of comorbidity with our high levels of communicable diseases, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and so on and so forth. The initial indication would be, however, that the age difference would mean that morbidity in Africa may be significantly lower. But simply, we don't know. In a year's time, maybe we will be able to design a responsible forecast of what the impact is. But as I've indicated, even just looking at the economic and the poverty impact, it's going to be huge.
Two particular issues that I think are going to be especially challenging. Firstly, it's quite clear that at least temporarily, it may be longer term, the bottom has fallen out of the export market for many of Africa's main produce. Oil is obvious, but also other primary resources and even some of the agricultural products. The Kenyan flour industry has fallen on terrible hard times. And secondly, the West itself is having to go deep into debt to try and tackle the consequences of this virus, both the economic ones and the health ones. There are going to be less money around. It is going to be harder for African countries to raise money, whether it's on the bond markets or from aid. Western countries have relatively firmly committed themselves to continuing to support Africa. But the reality is attracting investment and private income, private funding is going to become much more challenging. So is Africa going to be thrown back very much on its own resources to chart a future growth trajectory?
So I have a chapter in the book where I look at external support and I model the impact of what is the impact of remittances, aid, and foreign direct investment. And there's a separate chapter that looks at the impact of the implementation of trade, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So on the one side, global economies, if we look long term, let's say take 2030, 2040, global economies are growing. And therefore, even if countries stick to their fairly modest percentages of income that they provide to aid, the amounts are increasing. And the reality is that low-income African countries remain quite dependent on aid. Foreign direct investment, which we all believe is the growth thing of the future, only really comes into play with upper middle income countries. So we all believe that Africa should not be dependent upon aid, but upon trade. But to get there, aid for low-income countries remains important. It helps build government capacities with all the problems and the challenges that we have. And the global community have committed to ending poverty by extreme poverty by 2030, a goal that is not achievable in sub-Saharan Africa. Forecasts in the book show that by 2030, about 500 million Africans are still going to live below $1.90, which is the benchmark that the World Bank uses. But clearly what we want is we want Africa to trade and to grow its way out of extreme poverty. Only more rapid growth and growth in employment in the formal sector translates into sustainable growth. It reduces unemployment, obviously unemployment, it reduces inequality and so on and so forth. So that's your to do that, you need to change the structure of African economies. And what we have, and you refer to that, is that Africa is increasingly becoming commodity dependent. And that is not a basis for sustainable, productive African growth. Now, Africa's recent growth spurt from about before the 2008-2009 financial crisis hit us was largely dependent upon Chinese commodity hunger. So China grew and it demanded commodities. We had the commodities, we exported it, and China sucked it up, and that allowed Africa to grow. In the process, we became more commodity dependent, China grew, and we are left in a situation where African economies are actually regressing. We are deindustrializing. And all these problems, which goes back to the issue that we have to change the productive structures of African economies by a variety of measures that I've mentioned, but of which leapfrogging, implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and industrialization, these three are all linked in today's digital economy, are critical. Without doing that, Africa will not grow itself out of its current commodity dependence. And this is only Africans can do this. The rest of the world can't do this. So we are back to the issue of leadership and governance. What we refer to as good governance, which means different things to different people, doesn't necessarily mean democracy. I'm sad to say. although democracy over time sustainably is the best system, it doesn't, there's no real relationship between democracy and growth, particularly at low levels of income. So there's no one single bullet. There are a number of things that have to be done.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in online listeners to ask questions in a second. So please now indicate if you want to raise your hand or if you want to ask a question. But just before I do that, the question of the African Free Trade Area, CFTA, is going to be critical to that, because the risk is that the pandemic throws more obstacles in the way. As there is a tendency to become more protectionist in these circumstances. But from what you say, it's actually going to become all the more important for generating African growth in those areas where there needs to be growth, manufacturing, the harder end of services, if you like, more substantive, and in the technology area. So how do you see that dynamic as playing out with African governments? Are they going to continue to commit themselves to the CFTA, which requires tough decisions?
Yes, it requires tough decisions, because what will happen, as you know, in the short term, is that African governments will lose the advantages of high tariff protection that many of them enjoy. It would require African leaders to step away from the tariff incomes that they get, to accept that over time, in actual fact, they will benefit because African economies will grow more rapidly, and that eventually will offset the tariff loss that initially they will incur. And that's going to require some tough leadership by Africans. That single fact, high tariff protection walls that we have against one another in Africa, has scummied many previous efforts at regional integration, for example, in East Africa and elsewhere. But if Africa does not integrate through trade integration, it will not grow. A simple way of thinking about this is that the European Union, which you guys have left, China and India and the US are big internal markets. And we are 55 relatively small countries. We need to grow our internal markets, because that is how you grow the value added of your of your exports and go up the value added curve. It's the sort of gravity theory of trade. So the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area is absolutely a prerequisite. And I think that the impact of globalization and of even COVID, I think, is quite different in the developed world as it is in Africa. In the developing world, globalization is a positive, it's a good. And the result is greater regionalization. Asia is integrating, Africa is integrating. In the developed world, globalization, the sharing of knowledge, and the fact that we are, in a sense, that free knowledge flows, in a sense, are threatening the developed world, creates a completely different relationship. So for us, we look at the future world that is growing and developing and exciting and presents all kinds of opportunities, whereas in much of Europe, the globalization and what is happening has resulted in a populist reaction, which I think that the reaction in the developing world is quite different. So for me, if I look at long-term trends, the long-term trend in Asia and in Africa, and possibly eventually also in South America, is a trend towards greater regionalization, towards greater integration, because that's, I think, we see the benefits that has provided elsewhere, and that also needs to come to Africa.
Thanks very much, Jakkie. Now we have a question here from Leonard Reiners. And Leonard, if you would like to ask your question live, then I think we should be able to get you to speak. If not, I can read it out.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Good.
Yes, hi, Jakkie. I hope you are well. Good to listen to you. I actually had 3 questions, but maybe I could take the last one. I was wondering about your views on the approach of African governments in terms of COVID-19 lockdowns or partial lockdowns and restrictions, because I've seen that it's a bit of different approaches being applied. And what do you find in different contextual or in an African perspective, what works and what doesn't work well, considering both the infection spread risk as well as the economic effects?
Jakkie, why don't you take that one? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Leonard, and nice to hear your voice. The Africans have all grasped, embraced the lockdown social distancing example that has been set in the rest of the world. But over even the short term, it's not doable in Africa. You cannot lock poor people that live in informal settlements into a tin shack and expect them to survive. If their survival, they live on the margins of the economy and their survival depends upon earning a few cents a day. So we have to find different solutions. At the beginning of this, when Nick asked me, I said that I think that the virus may follow quite a different trajectory in Africa. It's still too early to say, but lockdown in many parts of Africa can only be enforced through the most brutal manner by the government, and it will result in starvation. So we have to find a different approach, and that approach can only be through intensive community involvement, education, and some kind of community level. I wouldn't say isolation, but where policing or solidarity, where we bring in traditional and church and other leadership and find a different approach. It may lockdown. I'm in South Africa. We have a very strict lockdown. Yes, most South Africans are adhering to it, but in the Cape Flats and a variety of other areas, we've already seen food riots break out. Poor people are desperate, and I think the choice is not a choice. Africans will have to find a different way of resolving or responding to this issue. But it is in a certain way, as I tried to indicate a little bit earlier, we still need a bit more information. It doesn't mean we should hold back on testing and all of these important bases upon which we can make our decisions. But I don't think that individual lockdown provides a solution in Africa. It's just not possible.
Thanks. And we have a question now from Antoinette Sala. Who I hope you could give your question orally, Antoinette. If you're online, let's see if we can allow you to speak.
She's still muted, I think.
Yes, unmute there, try that. No, still. One last try. If not, I can read out the question. The question is, why is the primary sector, farming and food, not taken more seriously in Africa? And where will the energy for the working age population come from if domestic farming and food planning and security are not yet secure?
Two deceptively simple and complicated responses. Africans have never given agriculture in particular much attention. We've spoken about it a lot, and we blame cows for getting much more subsidies in Europe than and so on and so forth, and the high walls. But the agricultural sector is foundational to development. In actual fact, what Africa First tells, and I write about this in the concluding section, is that there's no shortcut. I refer to what I as kind of a standard, very simplistic standard model of development, where I say that all countries that have developed successfully have started by food self-sufficiency, going up the agricultural value chain, and eventually entering low-end manufacturing, going primary education, and good leadership. Developmentally orientated leadership is absolutely critical to this. So part of the story of Africa First is that all of this needs to happen. There's no shortcut, and that it would require a tremendous amount of leadership and coherence amongst Africans. I've forgotten the second. I responded to the primary sector issue, but you asked something else.
Yes, it was about finding the hold on a second.
Apologies.
The energy for the working age population.
Yes, of course. When you look at what the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and everybody else says, infrastructure is a huge deficit in Africa, and within the infrastructure deficit, in actual fact, energy, the provision of energy, is the biggest drag. Now, this is where innovation and leapfrogging and the fourth industrial revolution in the form of decentralized renewables can play a huge role. Modern technology means that Africa can get the energy that it needs through decentralized off-grid solutions. And this is, we still need the breakthrough in battery technology, and there's a whole chapter on leapfrogging and the impact that leapfrogging can have in Africa. But the largest innovations here are coming in the energy sector. We did a country study on Kenya about a year and a half ago, and we found that in Kenya, access to electricity is accelerating at a rate double the fastest rate that has been possible in any country previously globally. So that potential is big. Then there are also across the continent a number of very large infrastructure projects that will unlock more baseload energy, the Grand Renaissance Dam, eventually Grand Inga, once that gets going, and of course a variety of other projects there across the continent that can also help with some of the baseload requirements. But once we resolve the energy storage solution, it will unlock significant amounts of infrastructure energy potential. What is also important, and I guess this is always one of the issues that I'm asked about, is that for all the criticism that is directed towards China, what has happened is that Chinese investment in Africa has helped to make up for the African infrastructure deficit, including in energy. So, of course, has the Obama administration with their Power Africa initiative previously, which is still carrying on. So, yes, we have a huge deficit, but it's not like, very often we tend to say what we need to do is we need to have good governance, we need to stop corruption, and we need to educate the people, and then we will develop. The reality is that these things all go hand in hand. The demand for energy means that eventually somebody comes to the table and invests in building a railway line or whatever the kind of infrastructure requirements we have. So those things are all happening in Africa. And they are partly happening because largely of Chinese investment, because only the Chinese invest in infrastructure. Not only, but largely.
Thanks very much, Jakkie. We have a written question from Daniel Silk, who asks, are there any specific countries where you think the COVID-19 pandemic could induce social unrest that could become a serious political challenge to the established government?
I think there are many. Because as I've indicated, depending on how governments react, in general, I sort of make the point that I think that what COVID is going to do is going to make authoritarian governments more authoritarian, and those that have a facade of democracy, Uganda, Tanzania, and others. But it will also make democratic countries more democratic because it holds government to account. A lot depends on how governments are going to act. If you try a kind of a suppression strategy where the only way you are going to deal with this is by using the security agencies to suppress and hold people in isolation, which, as I've tried to indicate, is just not a viable option unless you really are prepared to kill literally thousands of your own people, which, that's just not going to happen. So I think one only needs to look at those countries. Let's take really poor countries like Malawi and Zambia, countries where you have a large agricultural sector, but a lot of that is subsistence agriculture. One can make the argument that those countries may be better able to survive and to not survive, to outlive the impact of the COVID crisis, because it also won't go into your rural areas that dramatically. People live, it is where you have large urban slum areas. Nairobi may be a good example. So also in the Cape Flats in South Africa, and of course in and around Lagos, in and around Luanda, and there are many examples. That's where I think where you could have a real game changer. But it all depends about these other factors that I've mentioned. What is the age structure going to be like? And literally, eventually, are we ever going to know what the spread of COVID in Africa is? Because I think a large portion of the population, particularly if they're younger age, are going to be infected and are going to fully recover. We will just won't know about it. And this is the one side of it. The other is the comorbidity issues that we just don't know what the situation is going to be like.
Mm. So there is the prospect in several places of the increase in inequality.
Yes.
an increase in the number of unemployed young people coming onto the market, and therefore, as you say, potential instability in a number of countries.
Yes.
Surely that increases the importance of African governments pursuing an active reform agenda to try and avoid this. What are the reforms they should focus on in these current circumstances where, you know, resources are short?
I think the common wisdom is that at the moment, although Africa is very dramatically heading into a debt trap, unmanageable debt at the moment, because our economies are tanking, and therefore where previously we had high debt to GDP relationships, what's now happening, but we were growing. What's now happening in the short term is that suddenly that debt becomes unsustainable. A lot depends if we are going to see a V or a U-shaped recovery. Is this going to, are we going to see a vaccine, and are we going to see the bounce back that the IMF reckons is going to happen next year? But earlier in this webcast, I mentioned I mentioned the growth forecast that I just actually ran the scenarios on what that's going to do. So the next year is going to be quite dangerous in Africa, given if we have this sharp recovery that we are referring to. So generally, African governments there is talk of a debt standstill, or there is agreement or partial agreement on a debt standstill. But I think the idea is to try and relieve the pressures that we see. So although debt is a huge challenge, I think that at the moment trying to infuse liquidity into African markets is becoming absolutely a requirement. Over the medium to long term, I think that what COVID is going to do is it's going to energize the debate about the provision of basic infrastructure in Africa. I write a lot about this in Africa First, and that is that African urbanization has been facilitated by modern medicine. It has not been facilitated by having appropriate urban planning. We have provide sewage and water and electricity and so on to pay people. But modern medicine has allowed African cities to mushroom. And African cities are mushrooming with large informal settlements, slum areas very often, not because there is job opportunities, because very often people are fleeing dire circumstances in rural areas. And COVID and other diseases and pandemics that will follow this are going to, and this is only the first one we see, and there may be different waves that will follow. And today it's COVID-19, next year it's COVID-25, or whatever the case may be. And I hope that what we will see is an acceptance that investment in water, sanitation, and what we refer to as basic infrastructure is a long-term requirement that Africans have been able to avoid. So we rather build big railway lines and fancy big schemes that we can't avoid. And I think that that requirement, and there's a whole chapter where I model this, is absolutely critical for the future development of Africa. It is, in a sense, doing the basics, getting the basics right. That, of course, needs to be done before people arrive, rather than once they have arrived.
Yeah, no, this challenge of urbanization, and it's whether it's a dynamic, whether it's they're sort of dynamic cities that are going to generate growth, or they're actually consuming cities that consume the wealth of the country, is a critical one for the future. I think we may have an oral question from Laura Morrison. I don't know whether you want to ask one online, but you are very welcome to raise a question if you want. I see you here. But if not, there is an interesting question from another one from Antoinette Saleh, who asks, who should read your book?
In my view, of course, everybody. The book covers a range of issues, from demographics to industrialization, to trade, and to peace, security, and governance. So it really deals with many issues. I'm not an expert in any of these issues. As somebody who does long-term forecasting, I look at this at the structural issues that affect Africa. So I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know a lot about any specific individual. But in my view, it provides a very comprehensive introduction and overview to the challenges and the prospects for Africa. It sets out where Africa comes from. It gives an analysis of of Africa's recent history and where it is headed and what then should be done. So if you have any interest in the future of the continent, if you're a policymaker, if you're a development expert, or if you're just an interested member of the public, I think it hopefully provides a kind of a pathway to all the issues, rather than trying to think that there is some kind of a single magic bullet or some single solution to Africa's challenges. There isn't. There is only a set of matters that will impact upon Africa, and we have to look at all of these in consort, because only if you provide health, better health and food and education, can you build Africa's human capacity, and the human capacity is an absolute prerequisite to be able to grow more rapidly. And the book really is about all of these measures, but you know, I'm obviously biased. Nick, maybe you should tell you should respond to that question.
I similarly recommend it to everybody, partly because it's extremely readable. And it's a feast of ideas that you may not agree with all Jackie's assertions, but it will make you think about it. And how can African governments and African people begin to make a difference? Where should they be focusing their efforts? So I would recommend it certainly to all policymakers, but also anybody working in the development field, to give yourself a breadth of vision. That's, I think, what's especially good about it. I think I don't see any more live talks unless I see my former colleague Nicola Berlomo out there. I don't know whether you would like to ask a question from, I think, Kigali at the moment. Nicola? See if I can unmute you. No, okay. I think the connectivity isn't quite strong enough. But I think one last question here from also from Daniel Silka. Can I also ask, re the frothy GDP projections for much of Africa prior to COVID-19? Would Jackie comment on the use of these GDP forecasts as really reflective of countries with debt and other challenges?
Yeah. I mean, the IMF has okay, so our long-term growth forecast for Africa on the current path is about 4.6% out till 2040. 4.6% on average out till 2040. And then, of course, if we can manage all the interventions that I speak about and that I model in Africa First, of course, that changes. But this is not some kind of blue skies analysis of where we want things to go. But in the short term, because they use a single modeling platform, I do use the IMF forecast in the short term. Now, the IMF in October of last year released what we refer to as the pre-COVID growth forecast, and then in the 14th of April, they released their, let's call it COVID growth forecast. And this difference of 6% growth, average 6 percentage points in 2020 is huge. And I use that difference in growth to give you the forecast that I gave a little bit earlier of, you know, by 2022, what is it? 11 million more Africans living in extreme poverty, and the difference in the smaller size of the African economy compared to what it would have been on the so-called current path. None of us can forecast the future. We don't do prediction, and I don't have a crystal ball. But in the forecasting model that I use, it's really based on the fundamental drivers of growth, structural drivers of growth. And so we look at labor, capital, and technology, and look at how these are improving. And the short story at the moment is that Africa is growing. Things are improving in Africa, but it is growing slower than the rest of the world, particularly average incomes. And this is the critical thing. So I try and model how that can be improved. But if you look long term, the growth trajectory of Africa is a positive and trajectory. It will fluctuate from year to year, but the general trend, and there are some African countries where GDP today is significantly lower than it even was GDP per capita in independence in the 1960s. Yes, there are those. But I think that if one looks at the fundamentals, there's no reason why Africa cannot eventually emulate the kind of growth trajectory that we've seen, possibly not in India and the Asian tigers, but can advance its current growth trajectory from this 4.6% to maybe 6-7% over the medium long term. That'll take a huge effort, and it'll require some luck, but it is possible. The fundamentals are coming together for Africa, because remember that the future of the world is shifting towards Asia, and that's where global dynamism lies. And the next big growth story globally is going to be India. Now, India will never grow at the rates that China grew, largely because of its because of its services-led growth, and the fact that it's not going to have the demographic dividend peak that China and the Asian tigers had. So the whole world, the rest of the world, is really in a slow growth trap. It's only in Africa where your working age population is expanding sufficiently enough. But of course, future of work, technology, all of that is changing. So if you want to invest, Africa provides the single area where there is growth potential, particularly as you see manufacturing also reshoring, not closer to home, but sort of moving towards the market is. And these fundamental shifts, for example, in the location of manufacturing, that it is in actual fact moving closer to the consumer, just in time, smaller runs, more different type of manufacturing, provides Africa with significant potential. If our leadership, if we can get behind that, if we can get the African Continental Free Trade Area implemented, and if we can use the fourth industrial revolution and the advantages of digitization to our advantage. So the book is available on Amazon. It's quite cheap. I think it's below $5 at the moment. So I really hope that people will read it and send me some comments on it.
Thank you. We must wrap up, but there's one very interesting question related to what you just said that has come in. So as a closing comment, and that's from Ayiti Ajawin. And he asks, or they ask, how can Africa move into the technology business competition when China is already heavily invested in Africa? Will they let it? And you highlight in the book the importance of technology innovation as one of the ways Africa can leapfrog. But are they going to be allowed to do this?
There's nobody that owns technology. We create technology, and the African technology infrastructure is an exciting one, particularly in East Africa, Kenya, and so on. You see all kinds of startups going, and even on 5G, it's not like China owns this. So I think that it's up to Africans to invest in research and development, to use modern technology as best as we can, and we need a lot of that. China is generally considered to be the factory of the world, the manufacturing hub of the world, but the nature of that manufacturing, which is the driver of growth, is changing. As I tried to indicate, it's much more decentralized, closer to consumer, just in time kind of model. Some of us refer to that as the Alibaba model of manufacturing, and a variety of other factors that I think means that the nature of manufacturing and the distinction between manufacturing and services is changing. We refer to that as the I can't pronounce that word, servicification of manufacturing. And clearly, if you're, the distinction between these sometimes no longer helpful. But with every industrial revolution, there have been more, with every technological revolution, more jobs have been created than have been destroyed. And I think that that realization is also now coming to us. A year or two ago, we were all concerned that the fourth industrial revolution is going to destroy jobs. I think that debate has moved on a little bit, because we realize that digitization and it creates new opportunities. Coming from a low base, Africa can leapfrog more rapidly than anybody else, up to a certain level. But because we are coming from such a low level, the infusion of technology, it allows us to take a different pathway. We do not have to invest in the kind of industrialization that Africa, that you've seen in the West, railway lines and heavy infrastructure. So a very, very different kind of industrialization pathway that I think we are going to see in Africa, given enough time.
Thanks very much. I think you have just answered a late question came in from Larry Yon, what industries are poised for growth. And I think from what you say, you know, agriculture and technology is a big potential one. And also Oliver Windridge.
Brookings refers to this industries without smokestacks, which is an interesting concept, which is in a sense different way of getting the benefits from growth, from manufacturing.
Oliver Windridge asks, does your book cover the issue of corruption? And I think I can assure him that it does. Chapter 13 here on good governance, democracy and development has some very interesting stuff. So I hope Oliver will be able to get hold of a copy and read all about it. Simon Massey has asked about the impact of the COVID pandemic on migration, which I think we need a whole session on itself. Simon, I hope you'll be able to join us for the next panel discussion, which will certainly be looking at that. But I think we have to wrap up now. Thank you so much, Jakkie, for giving us so much time and such full answers. As Jakkie has said, the book is available on Amazon. Don't miss it. Africa First. And there's a lot more really interesting information in it. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all our participants for sticking with us to the end. And we look forward to you joining us next time. And we can pick up some of the other questions that have come in on that occasion. Jakkie, thanks very much. Goodbye, and everybody stay well.